Hi, my name is Mary McCarley, and I am the Health Education Content Specialist with Goodheart-Willcox and the co-author of their middle school health textbook. I was a teacher for 15 years in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools as a high school health teacher, and I now provide professional development and training for our middle school and high school health education titles. Today, I am presenting 10 ways to create an SEL skills-based health classroom. While there are more than 10 ways, all the activities and assessments are embedded in the slides for you to review today and in the future. All the activities and assessments that you'll see today are from our 2021 copyright middle school and high school health education program. We have an amazing award-winning author team. Both Catherine Sanderson and Mark Zellman wrote our middle school and high school health textbook. And all the activities and assessments and performance tasks were developed by an amazing award-winning teacher team. The activities and assessments that you'll see today were developed by myself, Mary McCarley, as the middle school co-author, and Diane Farthing, the high school co-author. And Diane is also the 2020 Shape America Western District Teacher of the Year. So let's get started. The three skills that I'm going to focus on today are responsible decision-making, positive relationship building, and self-management. So first, responsible decision-making. When I teach the decision-making process, these are the 5 steps that I teach. Step 1, identify the decision. Step 2, brainstorm options. Step 3, identify possible outcomes. Step 4, make a decision. And step 5, reflect on the decision. So here's an activity you can do with students very early on when you're teaching them the decision-making process. I would actually suggest doing this with a partner. I think it's great for students to talk through the process, and it also helps them to practice the skill of interpersonal communication. So this is actually a workbook page from our middle school program. Students are going to choose from one of the following 3 scenarios. They're going to write the scenario that they chose, and then they're going to go through the steps of the decision-making process. Note that on step 2, they only have to come up with 2 possible options and the pros and cons of each of those options. So here's another activity to continue to progress the skill. And on this one, they're really going to work on that step 2 of brainstorming options. So rather than 2 options, they're going to have to come up with all possible options for the person in the scenario. And for each possible option in step 3, they're going to come up with kind of best and worst case scenarios or advantages and disadvantages, pros and cons of each of those options. And this is also a workbook page in our middle school program. And I would suggest allowing students to do this with a partner as well, because we are still very early on in learning about the decision-making process and practicing going through the steps. So this is an activity from our high school program. And in this activity, the students are going to read an example of a decision someone made using the decision-making process. And they're going to review the steps this person used to make a decision and place a star next to the steps that were well done and circle the areas that need improvement. And for the circled areas, the students will give suggestions for performing the step even better. So I suggest that students do this independently first. Since they've already practiced with a partner on a few occasions, let them have a chance to do it independently first. And then once they're finished, allowing them to debrief with a partner, make changes, and improve their activity. So this is a decision-making template. And once students have had several opportunities to practice the decision-making process, I would assign something like this. Now, you could do it independently, or if you want students to do it within a small group. But basically, the students are going to need to identify a decision or problem that needs to be solved, and then go through the decision-making process. This is also a great opportunity that once students have had a chance to go through this process, is allow for maybe a full class discussion and allow either students independently or small groups to share out. So often, so many of my students say that while they understand the decision-making process and can go through the steps of the decision-making process, when in a real-world situation, they often will make a bad decision because they lack the skill of refusal. So I think it's really important when I teach the decision-making process is also provide opportunities for students to practice refusal skills. So here's an activity. It's from our middle school workbook that puts students in a situation. And in this case, they're refusing an uncomfortable situation to engage in a sexual activity that they don't want to. So for example, your partner sends the following text message to you. Come over, I have a surprise for you. You bike over only to realize that the surprise is that the parents are not home and you have the house to yourself. Your partner has dimmed the lights and lit candles. So what do you do and what do you say? So I would have my students do this with a partner. And I think that with a partner is really important. One, because it also works on the skill of interpersonal communication, especially talking about a topic that could be potentially awkward. So I would allow maybe 7 minutes or so to read the following scenarios. What would you do? What would you say? And then allowing time to share out. And I think that share out piece is really important because it does allow students to hear from their classmates. It gives them extra ideas and, as I think, more tools for their toolbox. So here's another activity I would have my students do with a partner once again, is now they're actually in the situation. They're being pressured. Your partner says to you, we've been together for months. I care about you so much and want to share this special moment with you. What is your response? So now they have to practice actually the pressure line coming to them and respond in an assertive way, saying no. And once again, I would provide about 7 minutes or so to go through this and then share out. So as we continue to progress this skill, students have had a chance to practice on paper with a partner looking at scenarios. Now they've also had a chance to practice with a partner, reading the pressure line and thinking about how they would respond. So in this activity, I want to put students in a more real life situation. So I would instruct my students that I'm going to pick a pressure line from a bag, and they will not have a chance to see it ahead of time, but I want them to imagine they're actually in that situation. And once I read it, I want them to think for just a moment and think about how they would respond in this situation, assertively communicating no. So as the teacher, I would pick a pressure line and read it to the entire class. And there's kind of always this awkward silence as soon as I read it, and that's okay because we want each student to process it and think about what they would actually say. Then allow some students, I actually allow quite a few, maybe somewhere between 3 and 5 students to share their response. And when they share their response, I let them know that it's important to say it in an assertive voice, not only their verbal, but nonverbal communication as well. And it's great for students who are really either struggling with this skill or very insecure to hear their classmates assertively saying no. So it will come up that students are going to ask to pick from the bag themselves and pressure another student. And my suggestion is if you have good classroom management, you've already created a respectful, safe environment for students, it could be a really good option because it does put students even in a more real life situation because someone their own age is pressuring them. So before I let Johnny pick from the bag, I may address the class and say, who would like to receive Johnny's pressure? I think that's really important because you don't ever want to put a student on the spot who's not prepared to receive the pressure. Some students are not ready and would prefer just to kind of sit back and listen to their classmates respond. So before Johnny picks, someone has volunteered. Johnny picks from the bag, looks at that student and pressures them. And then once again, that student will need to respond in an assertive way, both verbally and nonverbal communication. So here's another way of looking at the activity. So what you see here is actually the dessert section of projects that I created for the middle school program that I called menus. So menus include appetizers, entrees, and then desserts. And the desserts are all skills-based. And in this activity, they're going to be practicing the skill of refusal. In all three activities, the person being pressured should respond in three different ways, clearly communicating no and reinforcing the benefit of staying abstinent. So if you've ever thought to yourself that, or you ever wanted to differentiate a skills-based activity, here's an example of how you could do that. So as I mentioned, all three activities are about the same. And then I'm practicing with a partner, clearly communicating no in three different ways. However, the two students who choose this option, option number one, are going to practice together, but rather than performing for the class, they're going to turn in their scenario and responses for the teacher. The two students who choose this option are going to practice. However, they just kind of want to raise their hand and share their responses with the class, still being assertive. And then the two students who choose the option number three, which is the skit, are going to be those two students who want to get up in front of the class, they want to perform, and then they'll also provide a short skit clearly communicating no in three different ways. So here's the way that you can differentiate by learning style and also comfort level within a class. And I know the example that I've used is related to staying abstinent, but you could do this same type of activity with, related to drugs or alcohol or vaping or tobacco use. So I think to myself, in my school district, we had 9 weeks with students, and that was their high school requirement. And in those 9 weeks, I want to teach them content. I want to teach them skill. I want to have time to practice the skill, and it's really hard. And so very early on in my teaching career, I realized that if I was going to do this and do it well, I needed to get the support of their parents, trusted adults, guardians to help reinforce this skill. I want them to know what we're talking about in health class, and I want them to reinforce this at home. So very early on, I created what I called my Let's Talk series. And then when I became a middle school co-author, I wanted to make sure that this Let's Talk made it into the middle school program, and it's also in our high school program as well. So these are short homework assignments that are done between the child and the trusted adult. In part one, together, the child and trusted adult are going to choose one of the following two scenarios. What would you do? Create a plan if you're ever in this situation, and they're going to talk about it. Then the child is the one that writes the paragraph. I've just shortened the response lines so that you could clearly see the assignment. Then moving on to part two, you can see that they only need to discuss 2, but I've provided 6 because I want to make sure that they choose the 2 that they feel comfortable talking about, and then also what's relevant based on their situation. They talk about it, the child is the one that summarizes, and then the parent signs the pledge. In my 15 years of using these types of homework assignments, I have had parent emails, I've had hugs, I've had phone calls, and parents really appreciate the opportunity or the created opportunity to talk with their child about these topics. So now I want to empower my students to help others make healthy decisions. So since we're talking about the skill of responsible decision making, I also want my students to feel as though they can impact others. They can positively influence the decisions of others. So in order to do that, I created a small group advocacy campaign. And in this advocacy campaign, students are going to share a message and raise awareness about a topic that's maybe relevant in their school community or one that they're passionate about. So in step 1, as a small group, they're going to choose a topic and identify it here. In step 2, they're going to do research, and they're going to find accurate, up-to-date, valid sources to learn more about this topic. And they're going to write their research notes here. Then they're going to talk to school faculty members and teachers to find out what's currently being done to address this issue at school. and record their notes. Now, together, they're going to start to create a campaign goal. They need to figure out who their target audience is, what message do they want to convey, why is this message important, and what specific goal or goals do they hope to achieve. Now it's time to create their product. So I've identified the requirements with the bullet points, but I want students to pick what type of product they would like to create. So this is a choice board that you see here. And a choice board allows students to choose a product based on their learning style. So this is going to be differentiated by learning style. Always in the middle option, I provide student choice, but they do need to get teacher permission. Once students have created their product, they're going to move on and they're going to launch their campaign. But first, before launching it, they need to answer a few questions to prepare to launch their campaign. So why is this the best product option for your campaign? What do you need to make your campaign possible? Who do you need to make it possible? And how will you reach your audience? What's your timeline? And how will you determine success? And once they've answered those questions, it's time for them to campaign within their school. So if campaigning within your school is not an option, maybe consider a health fair as another option. So once they've finished, their step 6 is going to be reflect. Were you successful in implementing a meaningful campaign? What obstacles did you encounter and how did you overcome them? And what did you learn from doing this campaign? And I have provided a rubric, as you can see on the right-hand side, if that's helpful. So next, we're going to move on to the skill of establishing and maintaining positive relationships. Let's start with peer relationships. So very early on, I want my students to start to think about expectations. What type of person do they want as a friend? And what characteristics are they looking for in friends? And what do you bring to a friendship? So you could do a brainstorming activity, you could do a full class discussion, small group discussion, think, pair, share, or even a journal write. But in the end, I want my students to set 2 SMART goals that could help them improve a relationship or make a relationship stronger. So now the students have had a chance to set expectations for what they want. In my opinion, it's time for them to start to learn from their peers. So this is a short activity from our middle school workbook that allows students to survey. So they're going to survey 5 of their friends or peers to find out more about their thoughts and feelings on peer relationships. They may ask questions such as, what is the most important quality you look for in a friend? They're going to talk to those 5 peers and record their responses. And I tell them that while they're recording the responses, continue the conversation. And they're also working on this skill of interpersonal communication. Once they have asked all of the 4 questions and talked to 5 of their peers and hopefully their closest friends, they are going to reflect with the following questions. So now it's time for students to look into what skills or strategies help to develop a healthy friendship, or what tips would you provide someone for making a new friend? So the activity on the left-hand side is an activity from our high school workbook page, and they're going to imagine that there's a new person, Jessica, at their school. And so they're going to provide tips, 5 tips to Jessica for making new friends. They're also going to provide strategies for developing healthy friendships. Then students are going to self-assess and think about their own skills in developing and maintaining a healthy friendship. What do they do well, and what could they do better? The activity on the right-hand side, Rewrite the Story, is a workbook page from our high school program. They're going to read the following scenarios about an individual who is making a mistake of some sort within a friendship. They're going to identify what mistakes this person made that could interfere with developing a healthy friendship, and then they're going to rewrite the story and add strategies for building and maintaining healthy friendships. Students will love this activity. So I call this acts of kindness. And I want students to recognize that even little things in a relationship can make a big difference. And so together as a class, we brainstorm acts of kindness, things that they could realistically do with the time that they have. And then I challenge students to choose 5 acts of kindness that they could realistically do and go do them. And after completing these acts, they're going to write a few paragraphs summarizing how they positively impacted their friendship and peer relationship. Now, if students I provide it as an option, but students often enjoy it. So if your students have the option to provide picture evidence, I would encourage them to do so. They're going to love taking fun selfies of their acts of kindness. So continuing to talk about peer relationship, let's look at empathy. Here's a short activity from our high school program that allows students to examine and practice empathy. Students will read the following case study about James and Darshan. And Darshan is upset, but James does not seem to notice. After reading the case study, they'll answer the following questions. What are 4 things James could do differently to show more empathy towards his friend? Now students will have a chance to rewrite the script and show what they would do in the situation to show empathy and communicate effectively. So here's an activity that continues to develop that skill. So now students are going to have an opportunity to practice showing empathy. So first, and this is actually an activity from our high school program, I'm going to pass out this worksheet. And I'm going to give about 7 or 8 minutes or so and ask each student to read the following script or scenario. And I want them to respond as a supportive friend. And they're going to write in the space. So for example, your troubled friend says to you, I'm so sick of feeling so horrible. This is never going to end. So allow maybe 7 or 8 minutes for students to brainstorm what they would say to show empathy and support. Then I'm going to get students in teams of 3. And I'm going to assign each student a letter, A, B, or C. Then I'm going to instruct that student A, you are the troubled friend. Student B, you're going to be the supportive friend and show empathy and support. And student C, you're going to be the observer. And student C is going to use the following rubric to pay attention to, watch the body language and the communication style of student B, who is showing support. Allow time for that to happen. And then you're going to ask student C to debrief with student B and to tell them what their strengths are, maybe their weaknesses, areas that they can improve upon, and what they noticed about how student B showed empathy and support towards student A. Then change the roles so that each student has a chance to practice role A, B, and C on several occasions. Once students have had a chance to practice several times, allow them time to answer the following reflective questions and debrief as a class. And I did provide the rubric in case that was helpful. So let's move on to family relationships. I think in students' middle school and high school years, many students admit to having conflict among family members, even conflict between siblings and their parents, or the expectations or the rules that have been set. So as a teacher, I like to address this conflict and then also find ways and talk about ways that students can positively respond to conflict to encourage a healthy relationship. So the activity on the left-hand side is a workbook page from our middle school program. And I would have students do this in teams of 2. So in teams of 2, students are going to read the following scenarios about siblings and conflict. And what would they do to encourage a healthy relationship, but also help to respond to the conflict in a positive way. I think it's great that students work in teams of 2 because they can also share real life stories and situations that they've been in, and also provide support. The activity on the right-hand side, titled Resolving Family Conflict, it's once again allow students to read the following scenarios about both siblings and parents and guardians in conflict, and then provide advice on what advice would you give these two individuals to resolve their conflict. I would also have students do this with a partner. So let's continue talking about family relationships. And this is an activity that's going to work on effective communication and the skill of interpersonal communication. Students are going to read the following scenario about Kyle. And Kyle insists that, Kyle's parents insist that he's in bed with the lights out at 10 p.m. Now that he's in high school, Kyle thinks he should be able to decide when he goes to sleep, especially on the weekends. He is trustworthy and gets good grades. So in part one, students are going to think about the different communication styles and how people communicate. And depending on how he communicates, what might happen? What's going to be the result of the conversation if Kyle uses this particular communication style with his parents? Then, in part two, they're going to take a closer look at assertive communication. And by using assertive communication, what's going to be his plan for doing so? Then allowing students to reflect on the process of assertive communication. So as I mentioned earlier, if at least in my situation in my school district, it just didn't seem like enough time I had with my students to do everything I wanted to do, to practice the skill, to reinforce the skill, and I needed help from parents, guardians, and trusted adults in their lives. So here's just another example. I titled this one, Let's Talk Relationships, that gets students and the trusted adult in their life talking about these scenarios and reinforcing that skill of healthy relationships and also reinforcing the skill of interpersonal communication. So let's move on to dating relationships. Very early on, I want my students to begin to set expectations for a relationship they currently have or one they maybe plan to have in the future. So the activity on the left-hand side is titled Dear Special Someone. And I actually do this as a journal write. So in the lesson, when we talk about healthy and unhealthy relationships, this is the first thing the students do when they walk into my classroom. And I tell them that you're going to be writing a letter to someone special. And I want you to start to think about the expectations that you have for a dating relationship, either today or one you might want to have in the future. You know, what characteristics do you want? What qualities are you looking for in a dating partner? What do you want them to know about you? And then I provide them time. So I tell them, I want you to write a letter to this person. I'm not going to collect it. I'm not going to grade it. And you don't have to share it with anyone in the class. And I ask them to start. And often, for a lot of students, they immediately start writing because they've thought about what they want in a relationship. And other students, there's kind of this couple minutes go by and they're just sitting and thinking and looking at their paper, and it's hard for them to get started because maybe they've never thought about expectations. And so I find that it's helpful. I wrote one of my own several years ago. So I will typically read the first 3 sentences of mine and to kind of get them thinking about it. And then typically they can get started. So after about 10 to 12 minutes, I ask my students to kind of bring it to a close. And so many students are like, Miss McCarley, I've not finished. Let me keep writing. And I do allow time for them to continue to write. But then we'll tell them we have to get started in the lesson. But if you want to write some more, you can. So then I would ask, does somebody want to share their letter with the class? And sometimes you'll have maybe 1 or 2 students who raise their hand, but I don't put pressure on anybody to share. And then if nobody decides to share, then I'll say, you know, why don't we go around the classroom and everybody just say one quality or characteristic that you're looking for in somebody else or a special someone. And then each student will have an opportunity to share. So how to close this activity, I ask my students to take the piece of paper and I want them to fold it up. And for right now, either put it in their pocket or their backpack, but when you get home, take the paper and tuck it in a special place somewhere in your house, a place that maybe only you know about. Maybe it's in the back of your underwear drawer or sock drawer, and hold on to it. Because at some point in time, you may be in a relationship that you're not sure whether or not to get out. And when we get stuck in our love bubble, it's hard to see it for what it is. And you may need to read a letter, the letter that you wrote, to see if these are the characteristics that that person has. And so often in my years of teaching, students came back to me even 2 and 3 years after I taught them and said, Miss McCarley, remember that letter you had us write? Wow, well, I read that and I was not in a good relationship, and I'm out and I'm happier, and I'm really going to start to look for a positive relationship in the future. So this is an activity that I find that students are intrinsically motivated to do. Also, very early on, I want my students to start to think about their boundaries. I would encourage students to do this with a partner. And I do think any opportunity you have a chance to practice that skill of interpersonal communication, especially on a topic like this that could be awkward to talk about, I think it's great for them to do this in a safe classroom environment. So they're going to read the following scenarios and what would you do to enforce your boundaries with your dating partner, and then allowing students time to reflect. So let's move on to another skill, which is the skill of self-management. So let's start with managing emotions. So very early on, I teach my students the idea of I statements as a way of managing their emotions, for taking responsibility of their emotions, for owning their emotion. So often it's easy for students to say, like, you make me mad. And I tell them that let's practice using I statements instead. So I feel angry when, because now you can take responsibility for this emotion, and it also allows you to manage this emotion. So once we've had an opportunity to discuss this, now I want students to practice with a partner, looking at you statements and changing them to I statements. So here's another activity for students to manage their emotion and practice the I statements. So this is a workbook page from our middle school program, Being Assertive in a Relationship. And I would actually have students do this with a partner. I think it's great for them to talk about these situations and scenarios and what they may be feeling, and then also practice talking about it and stating these I statements. So for example, a group of your closest friends are having a sleepover and you're not invited. So allowing time for students to talk with a partner on how they could communicate their feeling using an I statement. And then once students have had a chance to practice with a partner, allowing some time to debrief as a class. So once again, you're seeing the dessert section of my menus. So I just wanted to show you this is another way to differentiate by learning style. So students are going to be in situations where they're angry at a friend, and that person should clearly express their emotion using two I statements. So once again, students can choose based on their comfort level and their learning style. So those two students who just want to practice and then turn it in, they have the option to do so. However, those two students who want to jump up in front of the class and do a skit and do have the option to do so as well. So now let's talk about managing emotions as it relates to resilience and building resilience. And there's three characteristics of a person with resilience, and those are the ability to embrace change, practice self-compassion, and take responsibility. So students are going to read the following situations. They're going to identify a negative response, and then they're going to convert them into a positive response or strategy, and then they're going to identify the strategy that was used, and that's going to be either the embrace change, practice self-compassion, or take responsibility. And you can see that we've provided some of them for the students just to kind of give them examples and get them started. And then others they will need to identify all on their own. And once students have had a chance to practice this in chart form, now in the reflection questions, they're going to have a chance to self-reflect and really look at their ability to build resilience and what they can do. So this activity also relates to managing emotions and positive self-talk. Students are going to read the following examples of negative self-talk and change those to positive self-talk. Once again, I want to gather this parental support or trusted adult or guardian. So in this activity, students are going to practice talking about self-esteem and their emotions with a parent, guardian, or trusted adult in their life. And this is an activity, also the parent, trusted adult homework assignment that's part of our high school program. So you can see that the format is a little bit same, but once again, in this situation, students are going to be responding and talking to their parents about stress. Always at the end, you'll see this parent pledge. So in addition to managing emotions, I've included a few other activities related to self-management. This activity is on managing healthy food decisions. And for this activity, I challenge my students that for 5 days, I want them to improve just one aspect of their diet, their eating habits. And maybe they're going to drink less soda or drink no soda. Or maybe they'll eat more fruits or vegetables within those 5 days. So first, students are going to begin by writing a short-term SMART goal. Then they're going to journal for 5 days. And these are then questions that I've included, but you could obviously change these to make them your own. Were you successful for that day in sticking with your goal? How did you feel at the end of the day? Why do you think you felt that way? Was it hard to stick to your goal today? Was anyone a positive influence on you sticking to your goal, as was anyone a negative influence? Do you think you can get used to change, used to the change that you're making? Why or why not? And this is also a fun activity. If your students have the option to do so, allow them to provide picture evidence. So this is another activity that's very similar to this activity, with allowing students to create a goal for healthy eating. You could do the exact same thing with managing their exercise and physical activity. So you want students to come up with a goal, something that they could do for the next 5 days to incorporate more exercise or physical activity in their lives. And then I would actually follow a very similar format to this day one reflection and allow students time to reflect each day on their goal. And if students have the option to do so, maybe provide picture evidence. I think students would really enjoy providing picture evidence about this topic. So this is the last activity under the topic of self-management. And for this activity, I challenge my students to change an existing unhealthy behavior or start a new behavior. I emphasize to students that they will not be graded, on their success or lack of success with this action plan. So you don't want students to feel like they're being graded only if they're successful. Like they'll get an A if they're successful, they'll get an F if they're not successful. You don't want students to feel that way, because they'll just modify and change their answers. So just let them know that they're not being graded on that. But they will be graded on their attempt to change a behavior, their well thought out action plan, and their description of their experience during and after the action plan. So this is going to allow students to really practice the skill of health enhancing behaviors and allowing them to realize that they can manage their behaviors. So in step one, they're going to identify the behavior that they would like to change or the new behavior that they would like to start. Now they're going to learn about the behavior, and specifically, they're going to look at steps I can take to reach my goal. They're going to research valid, up-to-date, accurate resources to learn more about this behavior. Now students are going to plan for change in step 3. Why do you want to change this behavior? Develop a SMART goal. How will I involve my family and friends? What obstacles or problems could I encounter? And how do I plan to overcome them? And how will I measure and evaluate success? So now it is time for students to start week 1. But first, they're going to transfer that SMART goal, and they're going to identify what steps. These are going to be their action plan. Their action steps. They're going to identify their action steps that they want to do this week. And they may not have and fill in all of the boxes, and that's okay. So they just may come up with 3 action steps for that week. What are they really going to focus on? And as you can see from the directions, they're going to give themselves a smiley face or a check mark on the days that they completed that action step. They're also going to journal each day, just really short. They're going to talk about their successes, their failures, their emotions, anything related to how they felt that day related to their action plan. Now they're going to go and they're going to evaluate. So they finished week 1, and now it's time to start week 2. But before they start week 2, they're going to evaluate what was successful from week 1. What action steps can I realistically do for step 2? They're going to transfer the action steps that they want to carry over to week 2, but they can also add new action steps. They can make modifications to their current steps, and then they're going to start week 2. And once again, give themselves a smiley face or a check mark on the days that they completed that action step, and also they will journal. Now it's time to reflect. So they're going to describe their experience of trying to accomplish their goal. Also, they're going to describe what this experience taught them about their successes and how they felt about taught them about themselves and their successes, their failures, their emotions throughout the week. And discuss what you learned about making a healthy behavior change. And do they plan to continue this behavior? Why or why not? So I did include a rubric as well with this assessment. So I hope the session was helpful in learning strategies, activities, and assessments to create an SEL skills-based health classroom. If you would like a complimentary access to our middle school or high school health education resource, just email me and I will connect you to the educational consultant in your state, and we're happy to provide that for you. Thanks so much for your time and have a wonderful day.